The snow had not stopped falling for 3 days. It clung to the rusted barbed wire and the collapsed barracks, softening the horror that lay beneath. In the far corner of the camp, a group of women, German nurses, secretaries, and civilian auxiliaries, huddled together in silence. Their uniforms hung off their bodies like torn rags. The wind cut through them, whispering through the wire, carrying the faint hum of an approaching engine. It was the sound that would change everything. A U.S. military truck rolled up to the gates, its headlights slicing through the frozen dusk. The driver, a young American guard named Corporal James Walker, had been assigned to escort supplies to this remote prisoner camp on the outskirts of the Harz Mountains. He wasn't prepared for what he saw. As the iron gates creaked open, the stench of rot and smoke mixed with the snow's chill. The guards on duty barely lifted their heads. Walker stepped off the truck, his boots crunching into the ice, and the silence swallowed him whole. What he saw would stay with him for the rest of his life. Behind the fence, dozens of women stared at him with hollow eyes. Their cheeks were sunken, their lips cracked. They didn't move. Some didn't even blink. Their hands clutched tin cups with nothing inside. The skeletal outlines of their faces seemed carved by starvation itself. They were prisoners, former German auxiliaries captured in the chaotic final weeks of the war, forgotten in the shuffle of surrender. Walker turned toward the nearest guard post, demanding to know when they'd last been fed. The response was a shrug. Supplies hadn't arrived in weeks, he was told. Orders were confused. The war was over, but the suffering was not. They're still the enemy, the senior sergeant muttered, eyes fixed on the ground. Walker didn't respond. He walked toward the fence, his breath steaming in the cold air. One of the women, her hair matted and eyes wide with disbelief, reached out and whispered something in broken English. "Please, bread." He froze. For a moment, the world went silent except for the whine of the wind. Then, something inside him broke. He turned to the gate, shouted at the sentry, and demanded it be opened. The sergeant hesitated, but Walker's tone left no room for question. "Open it!" The lock clanged, the door swung wide, and Walker stepped inside. The women stared in confusion. He walked straight to the one who had spoken, unbuttoned his overcoat, and draped it around her trembling shoulders. "You're coming with me," he said quietly. The other prisoners gasped, as if the words themselves were forbidden. No one had spoken to them like that in months. No one had looked at them as people. The woman, her name was Hilda, tried to protest. She didn't understand what he meant. But Walker didn't wait. He took her arm gently and led her toward the truck. A few of the American guards stepped forward, unsure whether to stop him. But Walker's expression made it clear he wasn't asking permission. For the first time in weeks, Hilda felt warmth. She was lifted onto the back of the truck, surrounded by crates of rations and blankets. Walker reached inside a box, tore open a tin of condensed milk, and handed it to her. She drank greedily, then paused, ashamed, as if afraid she'd be punished for wanting to live. Walker turned away, unable to watch. War had taught him many things, but never this kind of silence. Back at headquarters, the young corporal filed a report. He described what he'd seen: starvation, neglect, and abandonment. The camp had fallen between jurisdictions, forgotten by command. Nobody had checked it in weeks. The higher officers glanced at his report and moved on. There were hundreds of camps and thousands of displaced people. It was one more tragedy in a sea of tragedy. But Walker couldn't forget. That night he returned to the truck and stared at the stars over the German hills, wondering how many others were still out there, waiting for someone to notice. The truth was grim. In the aftermath of the Third Reich's collapse, chaos reigned across Europe. Millions of refugees wandered the roads, former soldiers, civilians, forced laborers, and prisoners of every side. Women who had served in German auxiliary units were often captured alongside combat troops, stripped of status, and herded into makeshift camps. With supply lines collapsing and communication shattered, these camps became islands of suffering. Allied commanders had neither manpower nor food to spare, and the distinction between enemy and victim blurred in the snow. Meanwhile, the press back home painted a simpler picture: victory parades, flags, and smiles. Few knew that along the broken roads of Germany, starvation still ruled. The war had ended on paper, but on the ground, survival was still being negotiated. The soldiers who guarded these camps were often boys barely older than the prisoners themselves. They followed orders. But some, like Walker, began to question what it meant to win a war if compassion was the first casualty. Over the next days, Walker returned to the camp again and again. He brought rations, water, and medical supplies. Each time, the women stared at him as if he were something unreal, a ghost of mercy in a uniform they feared. Slowly, the camp began to change. The weakest were taken to nearby hospitals. The rest received blankets, bread, and news that they would soon be transferred to larger, better managed facilities. It wasn't redemption. But it was something. Hilda, now able to stand, thanked him in halting English. "You save us." Walker didn't reply. He simply nodded, staring at the ruined guard towers and the gray horizon beyond them. The snow had stopped. For a brief moment, the sun broke through, lighting the camp in pale gold. The wind carried the sound of church bells from a nearby village, a sound of life returning, fragile and uncertain. That night, the young corporal sat alone by the campfire. He thought of the woman in his coat, of the thousand nameless others still trapped in silence. He wondered how history would remember them, if it remembered them at all. War was supposed to end with peace, but peace, he realized, was a different kind of battle. One fought not with guns, but with choices. And as the flames flickered in his eyes, Walker understood something he could never write in a report: that compassion, in times like these, was its own act of defiance. The war had taken everything from them: food, warmth, dignity. But for a moment, in a frozen camp in the Harz Mountains, one man's decision had returned something far greater. He looked toward the horizon, where the sky began to fade into dawn. The snow shimmered like glass. Somewhere beyond that light, orders would come, reports would be filed, and names would be forgotten. But not hers. Not Hilda's. Not the memory of what he saw that day. Because the world was about to discover the truth behind those forgotten camps, and with it, the haunting question that would define the next chapter. What happens when the liberators see what victory really looks like? Days after that first encounter, the story of the forgotten women's camp began to spread quietly through the U.S. lines. It traveled not through official reports, but through whispers in the mess halls, through letters scribbled by men who had seen too much. The rumor was simple but powerful. The Americans found one of their own humanity again. Behind that moment lay something deeper, a hidden network of logistics and discipline that separated the Allied forces from the devastation consuming post-war Europe. When Corporal Walker brought Hilda to the field hospital, the nurses were shocked. Not just by her condition, but by how the supply convoys had reached so far inland, through destroyed roads and shattered bridges, to deliver even the smallest lifeline. It wasn't luck. It was organization. In the final months of the war, the U.S. Army had refined a vast logistical machine, one that could move food, fuel, and medicine with clockwork precision across thousands of miles. They called it the Red Ball Express. Hundreds of trucks roared across the ruined landscapes of France and Germany, 24 hours a day, keeping the front alive. Each convoy followed painted red circles on road signs, simple symbols that guided them through chaos. Walker's truck was one of thousands that made up this artery of war and mercy. By the time he reached that camp, the Red Ball network had already delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies. It wasn't just an operation, it was a revolution in motion. Behind it stood engineers and mechanics who worked without rest. In abandoned barns and shattered villages, they built repair depots from scrap, refitted engines, and crafted makeshift bridges from tank parts and wood. Every driver learned to fix his own vehicle in the field. Every route was scouted by aerial reconnaissance and updated daily. It was a war fought not only by soldiers but also by those who refused to let the machine stop. The German women prisoners, many of them former radio operators and clerks, watched in stunned silence as the Americans brought in supplies. They had once served a system that prided itself on order and precision, yet here, even in victory, their captors managed something their own army had failed to sustain, a functioning chain of life. The irony was not lost on them. Hilda remembered the endless lectures about discipline and efficiency during her training in the Luftwaffe auxiliary. Now she saw it mirrored, refined, humanized by the enemy. For the American troops, the hidden advantage was not merely industrial power. It was mobility and coordination. Radios crackled constantly with coded reports, linking convoys to command posts miles away. Engineers had installed mobile signal stations that could be packed into jeeps, allowing real-time adjustments to routes. The system reduced delays, prevented supply losses, and in cases like Walker's, meant that food and aid could reach forgotten places fast enough to save lives. One particular convoy stood out in the weeks that followed, the March 1945 mission to clear the roads to Kassel. The area was still crawling with scattered Wehrmacht resistance, and the terrain was treacherous. Convoy Echo 19 carried both rations and medical crates intended for the newly liberated camps. It was led by Lieutenant Raymond Nichols, a soft-spoken engineer from Illinois. His orders were to reach a cluster of medical stations by nightfall. The mission was expected to take 10 hours. It took 40. As Echo 19 rolled into the forested hills, a sudden explosion tore through the lead truck. A hidden German anti-tank mine. The convoy halted instantly. Men dove for cover, radios screamed for updates, and within seconds the road was choked with smoke and fire. Nichols ordered his men to hold position, but they were deep inside unsecured territory. From the trees, rifle fire echoed, desperate remnants of the Wehrmacht, refusing to surrender. For the next 3 hours, it became a rolling gunfight. Drivers used their trucks as cover, firing back between the smoke and trees. One mechanic crawled under a burning engine to drag a wounded man clear. Another kept the radio antenna upright by hand, shouting coordinates until reinforcements responded. Nichols, calm under pressure, directed the convoy into a defensive ring, a tactic borrowed from cavalry doctrine and adapted for trucks. When armored support finally arrived at dusk, the Americans pushed through. The road was littered with burned vehicles and twisted metal, but the convoy had held its ground. 20 men were wounded, and 4 were killed, but the supplies reached their destination. Among the cargo were the same rations and medical kits that would feed and heal hundreds of prisoners like Hilda. The cost was steep, but the mission proved something essential. The Allied machine was unstoppable not because of numbers, but because of resolve. In later interviews, Nichols described the aftermath quietly. "We didn't see victory that day," he said. "We saw what it took to make victory mean something." The men repaired their trucks under fading light, using whatever tools survived the ambush. They wrote the names of their fallen comrades in chalk on the sides of the trailers, a ritual of remembrance that became common across the convoys. Each name represented a piece of the invisible army that kept the front alive. Back at the camps, that invisible effort was transforming reality. Field kitchens were built from salvaged tank parts. Mobile bakeries began operating on the outskirts of ruined towns, producing thousands of loaves each day. Medical units sterilized captured German equipment and repurposed it for prisoners. The precision of this effort was staggering. Engineers from the Quartermaster Corps designed collapsible water purification units that could fit inside a jeep. In a single week, they could turn a muddy stream into clean water for an entire division. For the women prisoners, this sudden abundance was incomprehensible. Some wept openly when handed bread. Others refused at first, fearing it was a trick. They had lived too long under systems where mercy was rationed and survival demanded suspicion. Yet as the days turned to weeks, the camp's atmosphere shifted. Guards began to see not enemies, but victims of the same machinery they had fought against. Corporal Walker visited often. He watched as Hilda began helping in the camp's infirmary, assisting the nurses who had once treated her. She learned English quickly, often translating for other prisoners. To the Americans, she became a symbol of something unspoken, the possibility of dignity even after ruin. Behind this fragile rebirth stood a force of organization and compassion rarely seen in history. The Allied logistics network, powered by relentless innovation, turned the tide not only of war but of recovery. Engineers refined fuel transport methods, mechanics designed portable heating systems for field hospitals, and communications specialists developed new frequency systems that could penetrate dense terrain. Each breakthrough saved lives quietly, without the glory of the battlefield. And yet, in the same breath, a shadow loomed. For every camp rescued, another still suffered unseen. Reports trickled in from regions deeper inside Germany, sites abandoned, cut off, starving. The war was ending, but the humanitarian front was only beginning. Men like Walker and Nichols stood at the edge of that truth, uncertain whether their own commanders would let them act again on compassion. By April, word of these camps reached the highest echelons of command. Teams of investigators, medics, and photographers began moving east. They carried cameras, clipboards, and gas masks. What they would uncover would horrify the world. The liberators were about to open gates far darker than any forgotten auxiliary camp. By late April 1945, the snow had melted into rivers of mud, and the roads of Germany were alive with convoys, refugees, and ghosts. The Allied advance had become a grim procession of revelation. Every few miles, new camps appeared, some hastily abandoned, others still holding survivors whose faces bore the same hollow stare that Walker had seen in Hilda. The truth was now undeniable. The scale of suffering went far beyond anything the soldiers had imagined. What had begun as a simple act of compassion at one forgotten camp was now reflected across an entire continent. When the liberators entered Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, and countless smaller sites, the scenes shattered even hardened veterans. Men who had stormed beaches and fought through hedgerows now wept openly. The scale of starvation, disease, and cruelty defied belief. 10,000 meals a day. They set up water purification plants using mobile generators. The same factories that once forged tanks now produced stoves, heaters, and field beds. The effort was immense, a combination of necessity and conscience that would shape relief operations for decades to come. Psychologically, the impact on the troops was profound. Soldiers trained to destroy were suddenly confronted with the responsibility to heal. Many struggled to reconcile these two identities. Letters sent home from Germany spoke of nightmares, guilt, and disbelief. One officer wrote, "I no longer know what victory means. We win, but everything feels broken." Yet amid this confusion, there was also pride, a realization that compassion could be as powerful a weapon as firepower. For the German women prisoners, the shift was equally jarring. Some were released and returned to their shattered towns, where they faced suspicion and shame. Others chose to remain in Allied camps, working as interpreters or nurses. Hilda stayed on for several months, helping the Americans identify missing civilians. In her diary, she described her captors not as victors or enemies, but as men who remembered how to see people again. Corporal Walker's small act of defiance, opening that gate and taking a starving woman to safety, became symbolic of a larger awakening. In the months following Germany's surrender, military historians and journalists began documenting these moments, though most remained buried beneath the larger narrative of victory. Yet for those who lived them, they carried the same gravity as any battle. Because in those quiet acts of mercy, something fundamental was restored, the idea that morality could survive even amid total war. Strategically, the lessons drawn from these experiences reshaped Allied doctrine. The notion that logistics and compassion were inseparable became a foundation for modern peacekeeping operations. The Army's Quartermaster Corps revised its manuals, integrating humanitarian supply systems into military planning. Relief operations in Korea, Vietnam, and even later in the Balkans all traced their lineage back to these improvised camps in 1945. The engineers who once built bridges over rivers now built them between enemies. On a larger scale, the psychological divide between conqueror and caretaker forced introspection across the Allied ranks. Soldiers returning home carried with them not just memories of victory, but of human fragility. Newspapers back in the United States began publishing photographs of the liberated camps. The images shocked the public, igniting debates about morality, justice, and the responsibility of power. Politicians spoke of rebuilding Europe, but the men who had seen those camps knew the truth. Before nations could be rebuilt, humanity itself had to be mended. Hilda's journey mirrored that transformation. In early 1946, she was transferred to a civilian resettlement office in Hanover, where she worked alongside American officers coordinating aid. She never saw Walker again, but she kept his coat folded carefully in her trunk. Years later, she would tell her grandchildren that a single sentence had saved her life, words spoken not as a command, but as compassion. "You're coming with me." To her, it meant the difference between surviving and being forgotten. For Walker, the war ended quietly. He returned to the United States, married, and never spoke publicly about what he saw. But those who knew him said he carried a photograph, faded and creased, of a snow-covered camp behind barbed wire. In his final years, when asked about the war, he would pause before answering. "We saw the worst of what people can do," he once told a neighbor. "But I also saw the best, and that's what kept me alive." Decades later, historians would uncover fragments of his report, long buried in archives. They found his description of the camp, his insistence that compassion was a form of discipline, not weakness. The report became a teaching document for new generations of officers studying post-war reconstruction. It reminded them that strength was not just measured in firepower, but in restraint. As Europe rebuilt, the legacy of those first relief efforts endured quietly in the systems that followed. The Marshall Plan, the Red Cross expansions, the Geneva Conventions reaffirmed. Out of the ashes of total war, the world learned that logistics without empathy breeds tyranny, and victory without mercy is hollow. The story of one U.S. guard and one starving woman did not make headlines. But within that small act lay the seed of something far greater, the idea that decency itself could be a strategy. The same engines that once carried ammunition would one day carry medicine. The same roads that led to battle would lead to aid. And the same hands that fought would learn to rebuild. In the stillness of the post-war dawn, as trucks rolled across the cracked highways of a broken Germany, the world began to turn once more toward life. For every gate opened, for every starving soul given a chance to stand again, history took one step away from darkness. Because in the end, the true victory was not written in the ruins of cities, but in the quiet promise one man made to a stranger, somewhere in the snow, "You're coming with me."